There is a house at the end of Calder Street that the town of Millbrook spent 100 years trying to forget. The walls hold carvings nobody was supposed to find. The basement holds a door nobody was supposed to open. And somewhere behind the iron gate at the end of that overgrown drive, behind the boarded windows and the demolition notice, flapping in the Georgia wind, someone left something behind. Not gold, not money. Something worth more than both. A man named Ezra Webb inherited that house on a Tuesday. By Friday, a developer with lawyers and a fabricated family tree was already calling his brother. By the following week, the FBI was in the basement. Nobody told Ezra any of this was coming. But the man who built those walls in 1901 did. He left instructions. Ezra Webb had $11,000 in his checking account, a 30-year mortgage on a house he didn't love, and a job title that changed every semester depending on which teacher called in sick. Substitute. That was the word people used, not educator, not professional. Substitute. He had spent 25 years walking into other people's classrooms, sitting at other people's desks, grading papers for students who would never remember his name. He had a master's degree in American history, framed on a wall in a house where nobody looked at walls anymore. He had a divorce that had been finalized on a Tuesday, which felt right somehow. Tuesdays were for things that didn't deserve ceremony. He was 52 years old. And 3 days ago, a lawyer named Fitzgerald had called him into an office that smelled like old carpet and told him that his uncle Harold Webb had left him a Victorian mansion in Millbrook, Georgia. A mansion. Ezra had sat in that leather chair and said very quietly, "I'm sorry, can you repeat that?" Fitzgerald had repeated it. Ezra had nodded like a man who understood things. Then he had driven home, sat in his car in the driveway for 22 minutes, and called his daughter. Renée had said, "A what?" Ezra had said, "A mansion." There had been a long pause, then "Daddy, mansions cost money." She wasn't wrong. The reading of the will had happened on a Thursday. The whole family showed up, which told Ezra something right there, because this family did not show up for things. His cousin Deshawn hadn't come to their grandmother's funeral. His Aunt Patricia had missed 3 Christmases running because of what she called prior commitments, and what everyone else called not wanting to drive 40 minutes. But they all showed up for Harold's will. They sat in Fitzgerald's conference room in their good clothes with their good posture and their careful expressions. Ezra's older brother Calvin sat across from him with the particular stillness of a man who had already decided what he wanted before the meeting started. Calvin's wife Brenda was next to him, typing something on her phone with both thumbs, which she did whenever she was nervous or pretending not to be nervous. Ezra's sister Gloria sat at the end of the table in a blazer she only wore to occasions she considered professional, which in this family meant funerals, job interviews, and apparently the distribution of estate assets. Cheryl was there too, his ex-wife, sitting across the table with her arms folded and her expression set to the particular frequency that meant she had opinions she was rationing carefully. They had been divorced 4 years. She still showed up to family things because she said she was there for the kids, which was true, and also because she couldn't stand not knowing what was happening, which was also true. Renée sat beside Ezra, close enough that their arms touched. She smelled like the same shea butter lotion she had used since she was 19, and that small familiar thing made him feel less like a man about to fall off a ledge. Darnell sat on Ezra's other side, arms crossed, face blank. Darnell's face was always blank at family gatherings. He had learned early that showing expression in this family was the same as showing a wound. Fitzgerald read the will. Harold Webb had left the Millbrook property Hartwell Manor, 17 rooms, 3 acres, circa 1902, current assessed value unknown, due to structural concerns to his nephew Ezra James Webb. The room changed, not loudly, nothing dramatic, just a shift. The quality of the silence. Calvin sat forward. "Now hold on." Gloria said, "I think we should discuss this as a family." Brenda stopped typing. Cheryl unfolded her arms, then folded them again differently, which meant she was recalibrating. Ezra said nothing. He looked at Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald looked back with the expression of a man who had seen this particular scene many times and felt nothing about it anymore. "Is there a provision for the other beneficiaries?" Calvin said. Not a question. A statement dressed as a question. Fitzgerald explained that Harold's liquid assets, amounting to approximately $34,000, would be distributed equally among surviving family members. The property went solely to Ezra. Harold had been explicit. There had been a secondary document filed 6 months before his death, affirming the same disposition, in case anyone wanted to challenge it. Harold had known his family. Calvin said, "That property is a liability." Gloria said, "You'd be taking on debt that doesn't make sense for your situation, Ezra." Cheryl said quietly, from across the table, "Don't let emotion make you stupid." And there it was. 5 words, delivered with the precision of someone who had once known him well enough to know exactly where to press. Ezra picked up the pen, signed where Fitzgerald indicated, said thank you, stood up. He drove home with the windows down, and the Georgia air came in warm and smelling like cut grass, and he thought about Harold. About the way his uncle used to sit on a porch that needed painting and drink sweet tea, and never seemed to need anything from anybody. About the way Harold had looked at Ezra at every family gathering. Since Ezra's divorce, not with pity, not with the exhausting tenderness people brought out when they thought you were struggling. Just with a kind of level recognition. Like Harold saw him clearly and didn't need to say anything about it. Harold had given him a mansion. Of all the things. He called Renée again that night. She said, "I'll come." He called Darnell. Darnell said, "When?" That was the whole conversation. They drove down on a Saturday morning, the 3 of them, in Ezra's Camry that had 140,000 miles on it, and a driver's side window that stuck when it rained. Renée took the passenger seat with her sketchbook open on her knees. She wasn't drawing anything, just had it open the way some people keep a coffee mug nearby, even when they're not drinking. Darnell sat in the back with his work bag. He never went anywhere without the work bag and looked out the window and didn't say anything for 90 minutes, which was normal. Millbrook sat about 2 hours south of Atlanta. Not a small town, not quite a city. The kind of place that had a downtown that used to mean something and now had a hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, and 3 empty storefronts with paper in the windows. They turned off the main road onto Calder Street, and the houses got older and the trees got bigger, and then the Camry rounded a bend, and there it was. Hartwell Manor, behind iron gates that needed paint, at the end of a driveway that had become more suggestion than road. 3 stories of Victorian architecture in a state that could charitably be called resting and honestly be called something worse. Turrets, wrap-around porch, ornate trim along the eaves that had once been white and was now the color of old paper. 3 windows on the upper floor boarded over with plywood. Ivy climbing the east wall with the confidence of something that had already won. A demolition notice was fixed to the gate. Orange paper, official letterhead. 90 days to bring the structure up to code or face municipal demolition. 90 days. Ezra stood at the gate and read the notice 3 times. Renée stood next to him reading it over his shoulder once, which was enough. Darnell read it, and then looked at the house, and then looked at the notice again and said, "What's the code violation?" Ezra said, "Everything, probably." Darnell said, "Yeah." The gate opened with a sound like something being woken from a long sleep. Hinges, rust. The complaint of metal that had been still too long. They walked the driveway, in the morning light, and the gravel was patchy, and the weeds came up through the gaps, and the oak trees on either side were old enough that their roots had begun to lift sections of the path. Up close the house was bigger than it looked from the gate, which didn't seem possible, but it was. Renée stopped walking. She stood there with her sketchbook tucked under her arm and looked up at the facade. The way she looked at buildings she was trying to understand, not admiring, not evaluating, reading. Her eyes moved across the roofline and down the porch columns and along the cornice work, and something in her expression shifted, just slightly. The professional detachment that she wore like a second skin loosened for just a moment. She said very quietly, "The bones are good," Darnell said. "The bones are the only thing left." She ignored him. She was already walking toward the porch. The front door key was on a brass ring that Fitzgerald had handed over with the paperwork. It was an old key. Not decorative old, not vintage charming old, just old, heavy. The kind of key that implied the lock it opened had been built before anyone decided locks should be easy. It turned with surprising smoothness. The door swung open, and the foyer of Hartwell Manor exhaled into the morning. Ezra had expected the smell of abandonment, mold maybe, rodents, the particular closed-in sourness of a space that hadn't breathed in too long. And some of that was there. But underneath it was something else. Wood. Old wood, well seasoned, the kind that had been chosen carefully and milled with attention. And underneath even that faint as memory, something like lemon oil. Someone had cared about this house. Deeply. A long time ago. The foyer was 20 feet high. A grand staircase curved upward along the right wall, the mahogany banister gone gray with dust but structurally intact. Stained glass windows flanked the door, deep amber and green, depicting nothing representational, just pattern, just geometry, and the morning light came through them and put amber shapes on the dusty floor that looked almost intentional. Almost like the house was showing off. Renée was already moving. Her hand trailed along the newel post at the base of the stairs, reading the carving there the way a person reads Braille. She went left into what had been a parlor, then straight into the corridor toward the back of the house. She had a way of moving through buildings like she was listening to them. Darnell stood in the foyer with his hands in his pockets and looked up at the ceiling. The plasterwork up there was extraordinary. Medallions and scrollwork and geometric borders, all of it gray with age but intact. Whoever had done that work had done it the way people did things, when they understood that doing it right the first time was the only time that mattered. "I need to check the electrical panel," Darnell said. To no one in particular. He was already heading toward the back of the house. Ezra stood alone in the foyer. He looked up at the plasterwork. He looked at the stained glass. He looked at the staircase. He thought about $2,300 a month in estimated repair costs, minimum. He thought about 90 days. He thought about Calvin's voice in that conference room, liability. He thought about Cheryl's text. Don't let emotion make you stupid. He thought about Harold, who had lived in the caretaker's cottage behind this property for 30 years and never once mentioned that the house existed. "Why didn't you tell me, Harold?" He didn't say it out loud, but he thought it hard enough that it felt like saying something. He went to find his kids. The kitchen was in the back of the house, added sometime in the 1950s based on the linoleum and the appliances, which looked like props from a museum exhibit about post-war optimism. The sink was dry rusted. The refrigerator had been unplugged and left open. One of the cabinet doors had fallen off its hinges and was leaning against the counter, with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time for someone to notice. Renée was in the pantry. She had found a section of wall where the old floral wallpaper had peeled back, and she was standing close to it with her phone flashlight raised, not touching it, just looking. Ezra came to stand beside her. The wallpaper had peeled to reveal the wooden wall beneath, and carved into that wood, not scratched, not casual, but deliberately, carefully, with precision, were patterns. Symbols. Concentric circles radiating outward, and within them smaller marks that looked like mathematical notation, like compass bearings, like abbreviated star charts. The work was fine. The lines were clean. This had taken a long time, and in the center, carved in a script that was elegant without being ornate, a single word: begin. Renée said, "How old is this?" Ezra said the wallpaper was probably put up in the 40s. Based on the pattern, he paused. "Whatever's under it is older." "How much older?" He looked at the carving, the depth of the lines, the darkening of the wood at the cuts, that particular aged quality that wood gets when it has been opened and has had decades to breathe and close in around itself. "Much older," he said. They stood there for a moment. "Who carves puzzles into pantry walls?" Renée said. "Someone who wants to be found," Ezra said. Eventually, Darnell appeared in the doorway. He looked at the carving. He looked at them looking at the carving. "Panel box is in the basement," he said. "It's a mess, but it's fixable. Someone did some work on it in the 70s that was creative." "Darnell." "Yeah." Ezra gestured at the wall. Darnell came and looked. He didn't say anything for a while. He reached out and ran one finger along one of the circular lines, not tracing it, just touching. Checking it the way he checked everything. Wanting to know if it was what it appeared to be. "This wasn't done by accident," he said. "No. And Harold knew about this." Ezra thought about that. Harold knew about everything in this house. He was the caretaker here for 30 years. Darnell took his hand back, put it in his pocket. "Then Harold knew about this," he said, "and he left it for you." They didn't say anything else in the pantry. They went to find the library. Hartwell Manor's library occupied most of the east wing of the ground floor. Built-in shelves, floor-to-ceiling, cherry wood that had gone dark with age but held its grain. A fireplace at the far end, stone, with carved detail work around the mantel. A massive reading table in the center that would have seated 8 and now seated nobody, its leather surface cracked and lightened in the places where sun had reached it for decades through windows. Nobody had curtained. A few books remained on the shelves. Most were gone. But the ones that remained had been left in a particular arrangement, and Renée, who saw buildings the way other people read sentences, stopped when she noticed it. "The books aren't random," she said. She stood 10 feet back from the shelves and looked at the arrangement of the remaining volumes. Different sizes, different spine colors, too irregular to be aesthetic, but not irregular enough to be chaos. "It's a pattern," she said. Ezra came to stand beside her and tried to see what she was seeing. "You read architectural drawings," he said. "I read anything that's trying to say something without using words." She stepped closer, started moving along the shelves slowly, tracking something. Then she stopped and looked up toward a section near the far end, and something crossed her face. Not excitement. Something quieter than that. The particular look of someone who has just understood a sentence they've been reading for a while. "There's a word," she said. Ezra looked. He couldn't see it. "Look at the colors of the spines," she said. "And ignore the sizes, just the colors." Starting from the left, he looked, he saw it. Slowly. The way you see a face in a cloud once someone points at it and then you can never not see it again. The arrangement of colored spines read left to right spelled out a sequence of letters. Some were missing where books had been taken or had fallen. But the remaining pattern was clear enough. THECHAMBER, the chamber. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Darnell, from the doorway, said, "What chamber?" That was when they found the portrait. It was in the parlor, leaning against the wall beside the cold fireplace, wrapped loosely in canvas that had dried and stiffened with age. Renée unwrapped it with the careful hands she used for things she wasn't sure of. The portrait was large, maybe 3 feet by 4, oil on canvas. The paint cracked in the fine network way that old paint cracks, like the surface of a dry lake. A man in a dark coat, seated but not in the way people sit when they're trying to look powerful. Seated the way people sit when they are comfortable with themselves and don't need the posture to prove anything. He was looking directly out of the frame. Not smiling. Not stern. Just present. Alert, the face of someone paying attention. A black man. Ezra looked at the small brass plaque fixed to the bottom of the frame. Edmund Hartwell. 1902. He read it twice. Not because he hadn't understood it the first time, but because he needed a moment. Edmund Hartwell, who had built this house in 1902 in Millbrook, Georgia, whose name appeared in the county historical record as an anonymous industrialist and a reclusive benefactor, whose photograph had never appeared in the town's centennial history publication, whose existence in this town had been acknowledged in property records and tax documents, and then apparently sanitized from everything else, was a black man. Darnell stood on Ezra's left. Renée stood on his right. None of them said anything. It was Darnell who finally spoke. His voice was quiet and flat and very certain. They erased him. Not a question. A statement. Ezra looked at Edmund Hartwell's face in the portrait, at the directness of the gaze, at the quality of stillness, in it not passivity, not resignation, but the stillness of someone who had thought carefully about every single thing and made decisions deliberately. "Then we find him again," Ezra said. Renée looked at her father. Something in her expression had shifted and she hadn't entirely hidden it. She looked away before he could register what it was. That afternoon, while Renée measured rooms with the professional focus of someone who couldn't help it, "Would you treat them with kindness?" Darnell catalogued everything wrong with the electrical system in a notebook, with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd been trained to find all the problems before picking the first one to solve. Ezra sat in the library with the dust and the arranged books, and Edmund Hartwell's portrait, propped against the wall facing him, and thought. Harold had lived in the caretaker's cottage on this property for 30 years. Harold had known this house, the way you can only know a house when you've spent seasons in it. He had known about the carvings in the pantry. He had known about the book arrangement in the library. He had chosen to leave this property to Ezra specifically, out of a family of 14 adult relatives who were all demonstrably more financially stable and considerably more vocal about what they deserved. Harold, who had never explained himself to anyone, who had pressed cash into Darnell's hand when Darnell was 19 and never mentioned it again, who had sat on that porch and looked at Ezra at every family gathering with that level look that said, "I see you, I know what you're worth, I'm not going to argue with anyone about it." Harold had left him a puzzle. A very big, very old puzzle, in a house that was falling apart, that he had 90 days to save. He thought, "Harold, what did you know that you didn't tell me?" He thought, I hope you knew what you were doing. He picked up Edmund Hartwell's portrait and carried it to the library and set it on the mantelpiece. So Edmund could look at the room he'd built. So the man who had been erased from the town's memory could at least see his own library while they figured out what he'd left behind. It seemed like the least Ezra could do. They were locking up, the three of them, the late afternoon light going gold through the dirty windows, when Darnell stopped at the kitchen doorway. He had the demolition notice in his hand. He had been holding it for a while, it turned out. He'd picked it up from where Ezra had left it on the kitchen counter, and had been turning it over, reading it, and then reading the documents attached to it, the supporting paperwork, the chain of requests, the official letterhead trail that these things left. "Dad," he said. Ezra looked at him. Darnell held up the sheaf of papers. Not the orange demolition notice, the documents behind it. The record of requests and official communications that had produced the notice. "Someone pushed for this," Darnell said. "This didn't come from code enforcement." Ezra crossed the kitchen, took the papers. He read. The demolition request had originated not from a routine inspection but from a formal complaint filed 3 years ago. Filed by a development group. Filed before Harold Webb had died. Filed, and here was the part that made Ezra's jaw tighten, filed by an entity called Cross Southern Development LLC. He read the name again. He had seen that name that week. On a sign at the edge of Millbrook's downtown. A construction fence around a large excavated lot. The kind of signage that announces something large is coming and invites you to be excited about it. Reginald Cross. Who had filed a formal complaint about a building he had no legal relationship to, 3 years before its owner died, apparently to generate municipal pressure on the property. Ezra looked up at Darnell. Darnell's face was still blank. But his eyes were doing something. "He's been waiting for this property to come loose," Darnell said. "For at least 3 years, probably longer." Renée appeared in the doorway from the corridor. She looked at her father's face, then at Darnell's face. "What happened?" she said. Ezra handed her the papers. She read. Her expression went the particular way it went when she was processing something that made her angry, not hot anger, not the kind that showed immediately, but the slow cold variety that sat in the chest and didn't move. "He manufactured the pressure," she said. "Yes. To force a sale. That's what it looks like." She handed the papers back. "Then he knew something about this property that we don't know yet." Ezra looked at the papers in his hand. Then he looked at the kitchen wall where, behind a layer of faded floral wallpaper, Edmund Hartwell had carved the word "begin" into old wood and left it for someone to find. "Not for long," he said. They drove back to Atlanta as the sun dropped behind the tree line and the highway went orange. Renée had her sketchbook open now and was drawing not the mansion itself but the proportions of it, the floor plan as she'd walked it, rooms noted with their approximate dimensions and question marks where she hadn't been able to access. Darnell was asleep in the back seat within 20 minutes. Ezra drove. The radio was off. The stuck window on his side let in a thin stream of air and the smell of Georgia at dusk, which was pine trees and warm asphalt, and something green he had never been able to name. His phone rang at 8:15. He answered through the car speakers. Calvin's voice filled the Camry. Ezra said, "We can work with it." "Ezra, Calvin. I talked to a contractor I know. Just informally, just to get a sense." He said, "Victorian properties in that kind of condition. The repair estimate alone. I know what the repair estimate is." "Then you know it's more than you make in a year." Ezra looked at the highway. "More than I make in 10. A silence. Then Calvin, with the particular gentleness that meant he had given up arguing and switched to a different approach. "I can put you in touch with a buyer, someone who deals in distressed properties, no inspection contingencies, cash close. You'd walk away with something. More than nothing, more than you have now." "Who's the buyer?" "Someone I know through business. Reginald Cross. He's been—" No. The word came out before Ezra had finished deciding to say it. Calvin was quiet. "That property isn't for sale," Ezra said. Thank you for calling, Calvin." He ended the call. Renée had her sketchbook closed now. She was looking at the side of his face. "Cross went through Calvin," she said. "Fast work." She was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to let this go." "No, he knows something." "Yes." She opened her sketchbook again, drew something quickly, a corner detail she'd noticed, the junction between the porch column and the eave, the particular way the carpenter had managed that join. Then she said, without looking up, "We need to know what he knows before he knows we're looking." Ezra drove. He thought about Edmund Hartwell, who had built something extraordinary in 1902 in a town that had subsequently decided not to remember him, who had carved a single word into a pantry wall. "Begin, tomorrow," Ezra said. "We go to the library." Renée said, "Odessa Pruitt. You know her?" Harold mentioned her once. Said she was the only person in Millbrook who'd kept records of things the town wanted to forget. Renée looked out the passenger window. Harold apparently came to see her every few months for about 15 years. Ezra took that in, turned it over. Harold had been maintaining a relationship with a town librarian for 15 years, visiting her regularly, while living 30 yards from a Victorian mansion full of unsolved puzzles. While never mentioning any of this to anyone in the family, Harold, Ezra said quietly, to the windshield, to the dark Georgia highway, to nobody. "You could have just written me a letter." From the back seat, without opening his eyes, Darnell said, "He wrote you a house." Then he went back to sleep. Ezra drove. The highway opened up and the trees fell back and the sky was fully dark now and full of stars. And he thought about a man named Edmund Hartwell who had built something remarkable and been erased from the record, and had apparently found a way to leave a message across a century for someone he would never meet. He thought about a demolition notice on an orange piece of paper, about a developer who had been working to get that notice issued for 3 years before Harold was even gone. He thought about Calvin's voice on the phone. Clean and reasonable and helpful. Be practical. Walk away with something. He thought about what Harold had pressed into his hand at the last Christmas they had spent together, 2 years ago. Not money, not a card. Just Harold's grip on his forearm, brief and firm, and Harold's eyes on his face with that level look. "You'll know when it's yours," Harold had said. At the time Ezra had nodded and thought it meant something about teaching. About finding the right job, the right school, the right position that would finally feel permanent. He understood now that it had meant this house, this puzzle, this portrait on a mantelpiece in a library no one had entered in decades. He thought, "Harold, I'm going to try." Then he turned the radio on low and drove the last 40 miles home and thought about nothing but the road. Odessa Pruitt had worked at the Millbrook Public Library for 31 years, and in that time she had developed a very particular skill. She could tell, within 40 seconds of a person walking through her door, whether they were looking for information or looking for confirmation. Most people wanted confirmation. They already believed something, and they wanted the library to agree with them. They wanted a fact that fit the shape of what they already knew. Odessa was kind to these people. She helped them find what they wanted. She did not tell them that finding what you already believe is not the same as learning something. The people looking for real information were rarer. They came in with a different quality of attention. Less certain, more uncomfortable. Like they had already sensed that what they were about to find out would cost them something. Ezra Webb walked through her door on a Sunday morning with his daughter and his son, and that second quality written all over him. Odessa had been expecting them for about 15 years. She was 67 years old. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and a linen blouse the color of cedar and earrings that were large enough to mean something without being large enough to be a statement. She had the posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that the world would simply have to accommodate her upright spine. She looked at Ezra Webb and said, "You found the portrait." He stopped walking. "Harold said you would," she said. "He said whoever found the portrait first was paying attention." Renée said, "You knew Harold." "I knew Harold very well." Odessa set down the book she had been cataloging. "He came to see me every few months for about 15 years. We had tea. We talked about Edmund Hartwell. And then Harold went back to his cottage and I went back to my shelves, and we both waited for someone to walk through that door with the right question." Ezra said, "What's the right question?" Odessa looked at him over the top of her glasses. "You already asked it," she said. "Last Tuesday, when you called ahead to ask if we had historical records on Edmund Hartwell. Not his property, not his estate. Him." She paused. Most people who came sniffing around this property over the years asked about the land, the value, the records of ownership. Another pause. "You asked who he was." Darnell from behind Ezra's left shoulder. "And that's different. That is entirely different," Odessa said. She led them to the back. Not the public reading room. Not the reference section. She led them through a door marked staff only and down a short corridor and into a room that was not on the library's official floor plan, which Renée noted, quietly, to herself, and filed away. The room smelled like paper and cedar and something that might have been coffee from about 3 hours ago. Metal shelving units along 2 walls. Archival boxes in labeled rows. A table in the center with 4 chairs and a lamp that put out good honest light. Odessa pulled a box from the second shelf, set it on the table. Harold brought me things, she said. Over the years. Documents he found in the cottage, in the outbuildings, in parts of the house he was maintaining. He understood that he was a caretaker in the literal sense, that his job was to keep things safe until someone who knew what to do with them arrived. She opened the box. He said Ezra would come eventually. He said Ezra was the one who understood that history wasn't just what happened. It was what got kept. Ezra sat down at the table. Inside the box were photographs, documents, a ledger with a cracked spine, several envelopes sealed, with dates written on the outside in handwriting that was precise and small, and a photograph. Odessa set it in front of Ezra. Edmund Hartwell, standing in front of the manor during construction, 1901, based on the date penciled on the back. Not a formal portrait, a working photograph. He was in shirt sleeves, standing beside a foundation wall that was mid-build, the stone fresh and pale. Looking at the camera with the same directness as the painted portrait, but more immediate. More present, a black man, building something, in Millbrook, Georgia, in 1901. Ezra looked at the photograph for a long time. There's nothing about him in the town records, he said. The Centennial History, the newspaper archive, the Historical Society website. No, Odessa said. How? She sat down across from him, folded her hands on the table. Edmund Hartwell arrived in Millbrook in 1899. He had money, railroad money, investment money, the kind of money that in that era moved faster than the social structures designed to prevent certain people from having it. He bought land. He built. He filed the correct paperwork, paid the correct taxes, hired local labor, white and black both, and for a period of about 8 years he was considered, if not exactly accepted, then at least tolerated. She paused. He was too useful to exclude entirely. He was funding projects. He was generating employment. The town needed what he brought. And then, Ezra said, and then the usefulness calculation changed. Other investors arrived. Ones who found Edmund's presence in the town's property records inconvenient for reasons that don't require a great deal of explanation. There was a campaign, not dramatic, nothing you could point to as a single event. Just a gradual process of erasure. His name removed from records where it could be removed. His contributions attributed to others where attribution was possible. His photograph removed from publications. She looked at the photograph on the table. By 1925, Edmund Hartwell was functionally invisible in the town's official memory. Still present. Still here. Still paying taxes on his land. But invisible. Renée said quietly from the end of the table, and in 1931 he disappeared. He was forced out, Odessa said. The documentation for that is thinner, because the people who forced him out were careful. But what Harold found over 30 years in that house, and what I have in these boxes, makes the shape of it clear enough. She looked at Ezra. He was a black man, who had built something significant and accumulated significant assets in a place and time that had decided such things were not permitted. When the Depression came and the social pressures that came with it, the forces that had been content to merely make him invisible decided that invisible was no longer enough. The room was quiet. Darnell, who had been standing the whole time, pulled out the remaining chair and sat down. Odessa noticed this, said nothing about it, but noticed. What did he do with his assets, Ezra said. That, Odessa said, is what Harold spent 30 years trying to understand. She slid the ledger across the table. And what I believe that house is trying to tell you. They spent 4 hours in that room. Odessa provided context. The boxes provided detail. And Ezra, who had spent 25 years teaching American history, including the particular chapter that covered what happened to black wealth in the South during the first half of the 20th century, found himself reading documents that he had taught as abstractions made suddenly and specifically real. Edmund Hartwell had been a meticulous record keeper. The ledger tracked not just finances but decisions, why he had purchased specific parcels of land, why he had invested in specific companies. Notes in the margins that revealed a man thinking 30 years ahead, 50 years ahead, thinking about what would hold value past the immediate crisis that he clearly sensed coming. The man had known. Not just about the depression, though he had sensed that too. He had known specifically about his own situation, about the narrowing of his options, about the likelihood that he would not be able to stay, and he had prepared. Renée was leaning over the ledger with her reading glasses. She had started wearing them 6 months ago, and still put them on, with the mild resentment of someone who hadn't entirely made peace with the situation, and her finger moved along a column of entries from 1928. "He's parceling things," she said. "Look at this, he's taking assets that are in his name and distributing them across what are these entities?" Odessa said, "Companies, trusts, legal structures that existed under other names but that Edmund controlled through a system of agreements and recorded instruments." She paused. "Instruments that are still on file with the county recorder's office, because they were never tested, because no one knew to look for them." Darnell looked up from the photograph he'd been examining. Ezra and Renée both looked at Odessa. Odessa said, "Edmund didn't just hide his personal wealth. He restructured the ownership of his land holdings in a way that preserved them legally under cover of entities whose connection to him was not obvious unless you knew how to read a particular kind of legal architecture." Renée said, "Land holdings, significant ones, how significant?" Odessa folded her hands again. Harold believed Edmund had retained beneficial ownership of somewhere between 200 and 400 acres in and around Millbrook. Through these instruments, which were never unwound because he disappeared before anyone realized what he had done, and by the time anyone might have looked, the documentation was buried in county records that nobody was checking. The room was very quiet. Renée took off her reading glasses, set them on the table, looked at her father. Ezra looked at the ledger. He thought about the construction fence on the edge of Millbrook's downtown, the excavated lot, the sign, Cross Southern Development LLC. He thought about the demolition notice filed 3 years ago, before Harold was gone, before this property had any reason to come to anyone's attention. "Reginald Cross," he said. Odessa said yes. "He knows about the land. He knows something. Whether he knows the full extent of it, I can't say. But he has been active in Millbrook real estate for the past 8 years, and the pattern of his acquisitions." She paused. Harold noticed it. "He brought me a map 4 years ago with Cross's purchases marked. The pattern of what Cross was buying suggested he was assembling land around a center point that he couldn't get to." Darnell said, "The manor." "The manor," Odessa confirmed. "Or more precisely, the legal instruments filed at the county recorder's office in 1928 and 1929, which are filed under entity names that take a particular kind of patience to trace back to their origin." She looked at Ezra. Harold believed that Cross had gotten close, had identified the shape of the puzzle without being able to solve it. Ezra thought about Calvin on the phone. "Someone I know through business. Cash close." Cross had gone through Calvin. Fast work, casual. Like someone who had been cultivating multiple angles for years and hadn't yet found the one that worked. "He needs the house," Ezra said. "He needs what's in it," Renée said. Odessa said, "Harold believed there was documentation inside the manor. The complete record of Edmund's legal architecture. The instruments themselves, or the keys to locating them." She paused. "He spent 30 years looking and couldn't find it. He believed Edmund had hidden it deliberately. The way Edmund hid everything in plain sight, but only plain to the right kind of attention. Begin." The word carved into the pantry wall. The book arrangement in the library. The portrait that had been wrapped in canvas and leaning against a parlor wall for decades. Waiting. Ezra closed the ledger, put his hand flat on the cover. "Harold chose me because I teach history," he said. "Harold chose you," Odessa said, "because you understand that a story isn't finished just because someone decided to stop telling it." They drove back to the manor with 3 archival boxes in the trunk that Odessa had released from the library's unofficial collection, with the kind of decisiveness that suggested she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and did not intend to let procedural caution interfere with it now. Renée had the ledger open on her knees in the passenger seat. She had her reading glasses back on. She was not happy about this, but she was wearing them. "The hidden floor plan," she said, without looking up. "Edmund filed the official drawings with the city, but the building as constructed doesn't match what was filed." Ezra said, "How far off?" "I need to measure properly, but based on what I walked yesterday." She tapped a page. "There's square footage missing. Not a lot, but consistent. Like there's a layer that doesn't appear in the official record. Darnell said. From the back seat, he built the real house and filed a different plan. He built exactly what he intended and filed a version that omitted certain elements. Renée finally looked up, which means those elements exist. They're just not documented. Ezra drove. Edmund Hartwell was an engineer, he said. Yes? With a background in railroads, rail infrastructure, which in that era meant tunnels, underground systems, concealed passages designed to function under load and not reveal themselves unless you knew the access point. Renée looked at him. He built his own infrastructure into the house, Ezra said, and filed the clean version with the city. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the bones are good. The same thing she'd said yesterday, standing at the front of the manor, reading the facade. But now it meant something different. He built it to last because he built it to hold something. Darnell said, we need to find the access point. Renée said, the carvings will tell us. They got to work. The next 6 days were the most focused Ezra had felt in years. Maybe longer. He called in his substitute assignments for the week. There were 3, and felt a brief flicker of guilt about this. The guilt of a man who has been responsible so long that irresponsibility feels like a moral failing even when it isn't. Then he got in his car and drove to Millbrook every morning, before the sun was fully up, and spent the day in a house that was slowly, reluctantly, telling him its secrets. Renée brought her measuring tape and her graph paper and her professional patience, which was different from her personal patience and considerably more abundant. She mapped the manor room by room, comparing her measurements against the filed floor plan, and the discrepancies she found she marked in red on her graph paper, with the focused calm of someone who already knew she was right and was simply building the proof. Darnell brought his toolkit and his notebook and his eye for what was wrong, which was the same eye as his eye for what was right, just applied from the other direction. He tested walls with his knuckle, listened to what the sound was and wasn't. Found 3 places in the first 2 days where the hollow tone was wrong for the thickness the wall should have been, marked them, and moved on. They didn't talk much while they worked. This was fine. They had always been this way. Some families talked through everything. The Webb family had learned through years and circumstances that sometimes the most important things got done in silence. That people who shared blood and history, and a particular understanding of difficulty, didn't always need to narrate what they were doing. On the 3rd day, Renée found it. She was in the main bedroom on the 2nd floor, measuring the east wall for the 4th time because it was refusing to make sense, when she stopped, put down her tape, stood back, looked at the architectural detail around the window on that wall, the way the molding joined the casing, the way the casing met the baseboard, and frowned. She went to the closet. It was a large closet for the era, built-ins on 3 sides. She measured the depth from the closet back wall to the exterior face of the house. Then she measured the room width and subtracted. The math was wrong. Not by much. 14 inches. But in a house where Edmund Hartwell had built every wall to a specific dimension for specific reasons, 14 inches was not a rounding error. She came to find Ezra. He was in the library with the ledger and the photographs, and a growing line of notes in his own handwriting on yellow legal paper. She stood in the doorway and said, the east wall of the master bedroom. He put down his pen. She showed him the measurements. He looked at the math. 14 inches, he said. Which is enough for a passage, she said. Enough to walk through. Not comfortably, but enough. Is there an access point? I haven't found it yet. She paused. But the carvings in the pantry, there are some that look like they indicate direction. Arrows. Almost. In a language that's specific enough to be intentional and general enough that you'd only understand it if you already knew what you were looking for. Ezra stood up. They went back to the pantry. All 3 of them, the way they always ended up. Darnell came from wherever he had been without being called. He seemed to have a sense for when things were converging. They stood in the pantry and looked at the carved wall. Renée had photographed the carvings on the 1st day and printed them at a pharmacy on the way back from Odessa's library. She held the photograph now and compared it to the wall, section by section. Here, she said. She pointed to an element in the lower right section of the carving, a small detail that could easily read as decorative, but that, looked at with the right attention, resolved into a directional marker, not an arrow exactly. More like the kind of shorthand an engineer would use, a notation indicating relationship between 2 points. It's pointing up, Darnell said. And east, Renée said. Which is the master bedroom. which has 14 inches of wall that don't account for themselves, Ezra said. They went upstairs. The access point was in the closet. Inside the back of the built-in shelving unit, a section of the back panel that was very subtly different from the panels around it. The wood grain ran slightly wrong. Not backward, not obviously mismatched. Just not quite continuous with the adjacent grain, the way wood isn't continuous when two separate pieces have been fitted together rather than cut from the same board. Darnell found it with his fingers before they found it with their eyes. He pressed. Nothing. He pressed the lower corner. A soft click. The panel swung inward 3 inches, then stopped. They looked at each other. Ezra pushed it further. It moved on hidden hinges, smooth and balanced, well-engineered. Beyond it was a narrow passage. Dark. The smell of dry old air and something mineral like stone. Darnell got his flashlight. The passage ran 14 inches wide, as Renée had calculated, and it ran parallel to the east wall of the bedroom for about 20 feet before turning south. The floor was stone, the walls were stone. The ceiling was low. Darnell had to duck, but the construction was solid. Load-bearing solid. The kind of construction that had been built to hold. Edmund had built this into the house from the foundation up. The passage turned south and then descended. Stone steps, 12 of them by Ezra's count. Then another passage, running east to west beneath the footprint of the house. They followed it. It ended at a door. Not a dramatic door, not theatrical or decorated. A plain iron door, painted dark, with a lock that used a specific kind of key. Not the brass key that had opened the front door. Something else. Something that would need to be found. Darnell put his flashlight close to the lock mechanism and looked at it for a long time. Triangular keyway, he said. Renée said. Which means we're looking for a triangular key. Which Edmund probably didn't leave in an obvious location, Ezra said. Darnell said no. But he left instructions. He looked back the way they had come. In the carvings. Which we haven't fully decoded. They went back to the carvings. This was day 4. Ezra spent 8 hours with the pantry carvings and the photographs Renée had made, and the notes from Odessa's archival boxes, and the working theory that Edmund Hartwell had designed this entire system with the precision of an engineer and the patience of a man who understood he was building for an unknown future recipient. He was a teacher. He understood the structure of problems designed to be solved by someone who didn't yet know they needed to solve them. He understood the logic of scaffolded information give the learner enough to take the next step, not the whole staircase at once. The carvings were a curriculum. By the end of day 4, he had identified 3 elements in the carving that were not decorative and not directional, they were locational. They indicated positions within the house. Not coordinates exactly. More like descriptions. The place of sustenance. The place of knowledge. The place of rest. Kitchen. Library. Bedroom. He stood in the pantry at 6 in the evening with dust on his shirt and the late light coming through the small high window and thought, the key is in 3 pieces. Not metaphorically. Literally. Edmund, who had built a house with a hidden foundation, and a concealed passage, and a door that required a specific instrument, had made the key to that door in 3 pieces and distributed them, so that finding the passage wasn't enough. Finding one piece wasn't enough. You had to have been everywhere, you had to have looked. He called Renée and Darnell into the pantry. We're looking for 3 objects, he said. Not large. Probably metal. Hidden in the kitchen, the library, and the master bedroom. Renée said, that's why the book arrangement spells the chamber, and not turn left. The library is one of the locations, Ezra said. But the books aren't the key, they're the marker. The key piece is somewhere in the room. Darnell was already moving. They found the kitchen piece first. Behind a loose stone in the fireplace, surround not the kitchen's main wall, but the old cooking fireplace that predated the 1950s renovation, and had been covered over but not removed. Darnell found the loose stone by tapping and found the hollow by listening and extracted, from a waxed cloth wrapping that had kept it dry for close to a century, a piece of metal about 4 inches long. Triangular cross-section. Etched surface. One edge cleanly finished, 2 edges cut rough as if broken from something larger. The library piece was harder. It took Renée and Ezra 3 hours the following morning. The carvings indicated the library, and the book arrangement was the marker, and they searched the fireplace, the reading table, the built-in shelves, the window seats. Nothing. It was Renée who found it. She was examining the fireplace mantel, not the surround, the mantel itself, the shelf, and she noticed that one section of the carved detail along the mantle's underside was different from the rest. Slightly higher relief. Slightly more pronounced. She pressed it. A small compartment opened in the mantel face, like a jewel box. Like something built by a man who believed that beautiful things could also be functional, and that the best hiding places were the ones that looked exactly like what they were supposed to be. Inside, wrapped in the same waxed cloth, the second piece. Longer than the first. The matching rough edges were compatible. When Darnell held them together, the two pieces formed a partial triangle with the remaining section obviously absent. The bedroom piece was in the headboard of the master bed. Behind a carved panel that Renée identified by the same grain discontinuity she had noticed in the closet wall, Edmund's signature, apparently, the place where his practical precision and his artistic sensibility intersected. Third piece. Waxed cloth. Metal, rough edges on two sides, clean on one, the three pieces fit together. When Darnell assembled them on the kitchen table, pressing the rough edges together and rotating until the fit was right, the three separate fragments became a single triangular key. Perfect. Balanced. The etched surface, distributed across all three pieces, resolved into a complete pattern, geometric precise, Edmund's engineering language made into an object. They stood around the kitchen table and looked at it. Ezra picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Solid. Made by a man who understood that the things worth keeping needed to be made to last. He said, "Tomorrow." Because it was 6:30 in the evening, and they were tired, and Ezra had a feeling that whatever was behind that iron door was the kind of thing you should encounter rested and clear-headed. Because some things deserved that. They locked up the manor and drove to the motel they had been staying at on the edge of town, 2 rooms, Ezra in one, Renée and Darnell sharing the other, the way they had shared spaces their entire lives. The way people who have negotiated a long history together do it without discussion. And Ezra sat on his motel bed and looked at the key in his hand. His phone rang. "Unfamiliar number," he answered. "Mr. Webb." A man's voice. Warm, professionally warm, which was different from actually warm. "My name is Reginald Cross. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Ezra said nothing. "I've been following the situation with the Hartwell property with some interest," Cross said. "I have a significant development project in Millbrook, and I understand you've recently inherited the adjacent property. I'd like to sit down with you if you're open to it. I believe we can find an arrangement that works very well for both of us." "What kind of arrangement?" Ezra said. "I'm prepared to offer $2.3 million for the property and any associated assets. Cash, no inspection contingency. We can close in 10 days. Ezra looked at the key. He thought about $2.3 million. He thought about his Camry with 140,000 miles. He thought about Calvin's voice. Be practical. He thought about Cheryl's text. He thought about 30 years of substitute teaching and the particular specific indignity of being the person in a school building that everyone was glad to see arrive and relieved to see leave because it meant the real teacher was coming back. He thought about being 52 years old. He thought about Edmund Hartwell in 1931, being told that what he had built was no longer his to keep. "I'll think about it," Ezra said. "Of course," Cross said. "Take your time, but I'd encourage you not to take too much of it. Properties in that kind of condition can deteriorate significantly over even a short period, and the legal situation around the demolition order, well, these things have a way of becoming more complicated the longer they sit." After he hung up, Ezra sat with the phone in his hand for a while. Then he set the key on the bedside table. He called Renée. She answered on the first ring. Of course she did. She was 28 and brilliant and had the phone sleep habits of her generation. "Cross called," he said. "I know." A pause. He called Darnell first. 20 minutes ago. Said he got the number from a mutual contact. Another pause. "He's working every angle he has. He offered $2.3 million. Silence. Then Renée said, "He doesn't know what's in the house. He knows enough to offer that much. He knows there's something. He doesn't know what." Another pause. Shorter. "If he knew exactly what was in there, Dad, the offer would be different." Ezra said, "How?" "Either much higher," Renée said, "or he wouldn't be making an offer at all. He'd be making a legal filing." Ezra looked at the key on the bedside table. The weight of it. The patience of it. The thing Edmund Hartwell had built to be found by someone who would keep looking past the obvious. He thought about what Odessa had said. About Harold. About the question that unlocked the archive. Not where is the treasure. Who was Edmund Hartwell? He said, we open the door tomorrow. Renée said, yes. Whatever's in there, she said, we figure out together. He said, get some sleep, she said. You too. He put the phone down, looked at the ceiling of a motel room in Millbrook, Georgia, in a town that had decided a century ago that certain things and certain people were better left unremembered, and thought about a man with a ledger and an engineer's precision and a very particular understanding of patience. A man who had built a house and hidden its most important room and distributed the key across 3 locations and carved a single word into a pantry wall and then disappeared into whatever came next, trusting that eventually someone would ask the right question. Begin. He reached over and turned off the light. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow we see what you kept. The morning came in gray. Not dramatic gray. Not the kind of gray that announces something. Just the ordinary gray of a Georgia morning, before the sun clears the tree line, the light flat and even and without shadow, the air holding the night's coolness for a little longer than expected. Ezra was up before 6. He had slept badly. Not from anxiety exactly. More from the particular restlessness of a mind that has identified the edge of something and cannot stop moving toward it even when the body is horizontal and the room is dark. He had lain in the motel bed with the key on the nightstand and his thoughts moving in slow circles, and around 3 in the morning he had given up, made bad motel coffee, and sat at the small desk by the window watching one parking lot. Now he stood in the Manor's kitchen with the key in his coat pocket and the smell of old wood around him and waited for his children. Darnell arrived first, 7 minutes after Ezra, also quiet, also carrying coffee in a paper cup from the gas station 2 blocks over. They stood in the kitchen together without speaking for a while, which was a kind of conversation they had always been able to have. Renée arrived 9 minutes after Darnell. She was wearing the dress she wore when she wanted to feel prepared. Ezra had noticed this pattern years ago when Renée was uncertain. She dressed with more precision, as if the external order could support the internal kind. The dress was deep green, fitted. She had her hair pulled back and her reading glasses tucked into the neckline and her sketchbook under one arm. She looked at her father, at the kitchen, at the passage door, which was standing open. Okay, she said. That was all. Okay. Darnell had the flashlight. Renée had her phone camera. Ezra had the key. They went down. The passage was the same as the day before. Stone floor, low ceiling. Darnell's flashlight throwing sharp shadows. Their footsteps in a quiet cadence and the smell of old sealed air getting stronger as they descended the 12 steps. The iron door at the end of the passage. Plain. Dark. Waiting. Ezra stood in front of it. He put the key in. The triangular shaft entered the lock with the particular fit of something made for something, the mechanical satisfaction of precision meeting precision. He felt the tumblers engaging through his fingers. 3 distinct points of resistance. 1, 2, 3. And then a sound that was less a click than a release, like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time. The door swung inward, not dramatically, not with effort. It was perfectly balanced, perfectly maintained, which meant Edmund Hartwell had built this door with the expectation that it would be used eventually, and had built it to be ready. The room beyond, circular, 20 feet across, maybe more. Stone walls, same construction as the passage. But here, lining the walls in built-in shelving that went floor to ceiling, were not gold, not loose currency, not anything that glittered or shone. Shelving units, metal, the kind made to last. Wooden crates, sealed. Metal filing cabinets, 6 of them with locks. Glass-faced cases containing documents behind the glass. Framed papers on the section of wall not occupied by shelving. And a table in the center, circular, same diameter as the room almost, with a lamp on it that was battery-powered. New battery. Recently placed. Harold had been in this room. Had placed a lamp on the table for whoever came next, because Harold had known someone would come eventually and had wanted them to be able to see. Ezra's throat did something he hadn't anticipated. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Just a moment. Then he walked in. Renée went immediately to the framed documents on the wall, her phone out, photographing. Darnell went to the filing cabinets, testing the locks, professional, systematic. Ezra went to the table. On it, placed deliberately, was an envelope. Not old. Harold's handwriting on the front. Ezra. When you're ready. He picked it up, held it. Not yet. He walked to the glass-faced cases first. The documents behind the glass were a mix. Stock certificates, some of which bore company names he recognized as entities that had become, over the following decades, significant. Railroad bonds, municipal bonds from several Georgia counties. And here was where Ezra's breath changed, just slightly. Land deeds. Formal, filed, witnessed. Bearing the names of entities he didn't recognize, but which, in the ledger he had been reading for 4 days, had begun to resolve into a pattern. Edmund's legal architecture, visible at last. "Dad," Renée said. He looked over. She was standing in front of a section of wall where several documents were framed together in a sequence. She was pointing at something, not speaking. Just pointing. He crossed to her. The documents were deed filings. 4 of them. Filed in 1928 and 1929 at the county recorder's office. Under entity names Webb Agricultural Holdings, Hartwell Land Trust No. 3, Southern Infrastructure Partners, and one simply called the Millbrook Fund. He read the legal descriptions of the parcels. He read them again. The descriptions were in the archaic survey language of the era. Meets and bounds. From a point of beginning at the intersection of following the course of containing in all approximately, but he had spent 4 days Edmund's ledger, and he had been a history teacher for 25 years, and he understood maps the way Renée understood buildings. He understood what he was reading. "Renée," he said. His voice came out steady. He was mildly surprised by this. "I know," she said. "This land, I know, Dad. The development Cross is building is on it." "Yes." They stood together in front of 4 framed deeds and looked at the legal description of approximately 340 acres in and around Millbrook, Georgia, that Edmund Hartwell had legally structured into entities that had never been dissolved, never been contested, never been found, because no one had known to look, and the people who had eventually sensed something was there had not been able to get inside this room. "Until now," Darnell said from across the room. "Dad, come look at this." The filing cabinet he had opened, the one whose lock had given under a specific combination of tools that Darnell had tried with the patience of someone who understood that locks were just problems with a tactile solution, contained files, organized files. Edmund's organization, precise and dated. But on top of the files, placed by a different hand at a different time, was a folder. Harold's handwriting on the tab. Recent. Within the last few years, Darnell handed it to Ezra. Inside the folder was a genealogy document, typed with attached copies of filings from various official sources, names, dates, a family tree traced from Edmund Hartwell outward, and at the bottom of the page, in Harold's handwriting, a single annotation. Reginald Cross Southern Development, not related, purchased fabricated documentation approx. 12 years ago from a paralegal formerly employed by Whitmore and Associates, Millbrook. Provenance false. Motivated by knowledge of land instruments obtained through same source. Filed no legal claim because claim would not survive scrutiny. Strategy, manufacture pressure. Force sale, acquire before anyone looks. Ezra read it. He read it again. Not because he hadn't understood it the first time. Because he wanted to be sure he had. Harold knew, Darnell said. Harold knew for years. Why didn't he? Because Harold understood that knowledge without the right moment is just information, Ezra said. He was waiting. For you, Darnell said. Ezra put the folder down on the table, next to Harold's envelope. He looked at both of them for a moment. Then he picked up Harold's envelope and opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages. Harold's handwriting, careful and slow the way it had gotten in the last few years of his life. Ezra read it standing at the table in Edmund Hartwell's vault, in the gray morning light from the battery-powered lamp Harold had placed there, while his son and daughter waited. Harold had known about the vault for 11 years. He had found the passage by accident, a section of the closet back panel that had shifted during a leak repair, revealing the mechanism behind it. He had found the door. He had not had the key. He had searched for the key for 2 years before concluding that Edmund had distributed it across the house in pieces, deliberately, to ensure that only someone who had examined the whole house could open the whole room. Harold had not examined the whole house. He had been the caretaker. He had maintained the structural elements, kept the systems functional to the degree that he could, repaired what needed repairing. But he was not a teacher, not an engineer, not an architect. He had recognized that the carvings in the pantry were significant and had photographed them and brought the photographs to Odessa. But he had not been able to decode them. He had known this, and he had made peace with it, because Harold had understood something that took Ezra a moment to absorb. Harold wrote, "I am not the right person for what comes next. I have known this for 11 years. I kept this property together, and I kept the archive with Odessa, and I waited because I knew that eventually the right person would come. Someone who could read the carvings. Someone who would look at the portrait and ask the right question. Someone who understood that Edmund's story wasn't finished. It was interrupted, and interrupted stories need people with the patience and the understanding to find where they were left off and keep going. I chose you, Ezra, because you have spent your whole life teaching interrupted stories. The ones that got left out of the official record. The ones that happened but didn't get kept. You know how to find them, and you know how to tell them right. What's in this room belongs to Edmund Hartwell. What you do with it is the final piece of what he built. Don't let anyone rush you. Don't sell what isn't yours to sell. And for the love of God, Ezra, don't let Calvin anywhere near the paperwork." Ezra made a sound that was approximately a laugh, pressed his lips together, looked at the ceiling of the vault. "Don't let Calvin anywhere near the paperwork. Harold." He folded the letter, put it in his pocket, turned to Renée and Darnell. "We need a lawyer," he said. "Not Calvin's lawyer. Ours." Darnell said, "I know someone." Of course he did. They spent the rest of that day and the following day in the vault, documenting. Renée photographed everything, systematically. Every document in every case, every file in every cabinet, every deed, every stock certificate, every bond. She created a log on her phone with timestamps and descriptions. The professional discipline of someone who understood that the record you made was the record that existed. Darnell cataloged the physical contents with the same systematic attention he brought to electrical systems, not because the content was his expertise, but because organizing problems was organizing problems and the principles transferred. Ezra read. He read Edmund's files the way he read primary sources for his classes, looking not just for what was there but for what the presence of each thing implied, what it said about the mind that had assembled it, what it revealed about the situation that had made this assembly necessary. Edmund Hartwell had not been wealthy in the way people use the word casually. He had been wealthy in the way that people with engineering minds and long-time horizons are wealthy not through accumulation, but through structure. The stock certificates were valuable but not extraordinary in themselves. The bonds had matured over decades into something significantly more than their original face value, but their real worth was in what they represented. Edmund's assessment, in 1928 and 1929, of which enterprises would survive the crisis he saw coming. He had been right about all of them. But the land was the architecture. 340 acres in and around Millbrook, Georgia, held in legal instruments that had been filed, recorded, and then effectively lost to institutional memory, because the institutions had not wanted to remember them. Instruments that had never expired because Edmund had structured them with perpetual terms, that had never been contested because no one with standing had known to contest them, that had never been dissolved because Edmund had disappeared before he could dissolve them, and no one after him had had the authority or the knowledge. On the third day in the vault, Darnell's lawyer arrived. Her name was Imani Broussard, 44 years old, Atlanta-based. She specialized in property law and what she called legacy asset recovery, which was a practice area that had developed over the past 15 years to address exactly this kind of situation. Black families discovering that assets their ancestors had legally structured had been lost not through legal process but through institutional neglect and deliberate erasure. She was not a small woman in terms of presence. She walked into the vault with a rolling briefcase and reading glasses on her face, and the focused energy of someone who had spent her career being exactly right at exactly the moment it mattered. And she looked at the walls of documents and said, simply, "Okay, show me the deeds." Renée showed her the deeds. "Read them again," said. "These are filed." "Yes," Ezra said. "These were never dissolved, never contested, never even located, as far as we can tell, until Harold found the vault." Imani looked at the deeds for another moment. Then she looked at Ezra. "You understand what this means," she said. "Tell me what it means from a legal standpoint." "It means that the beneficial ownership of these parcels has been continuously vested in these entities since the filing dates." She paused. which means that anyone who purchased land from these parcels, after those filing dates, or developed on land encumbered by these instruments, was doing so in a legal situation that is now significantly more complicated than they understood at the time. Darnell said from his seat on an overturned crate cross. Imani said, "What development is currently underway?" Ezra told her. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. "He built on it," she said. 60% complete, based on what we can see from the road. Another quiet. Longer. "He's going to try to challenge the instruments," she said. "His lawyers will argue that the entities are defunct, that the instruments have lapsed, that there's some basis for adverse possession. They will find every possible argument and..." She looked at the deeds, at the filing dates, at the witnessing signatures and the recorder's stamps that were as clear and legible as the day they were made because Edmund Hartwell had used archival ink on archival paper and had stored them in a sealed room with consistent temperature. "And they will lose," she said. "This documentation is clean. These instruments are valid. And any attorney who looks at these filing dates and the development timeline is going to see exactly what happened." She paused. Cross built on land he should have investigated more carefully before breaking ground. That is his problem, not yours. The FBI arrived on the 4th day. Not dramatically. Not with lights or vehicles or the kind of arrival that announces itself. 2 agents in a standard vehicle, suits, the professional neutrality of people who come to gather information and have learned not to telegraph their conclusions while doing it. They had been contacted by Imani, who had understood that the genealogy document in Harold's folder, the one detailing Cross's purchase of fabricated family history documentation, was not a civil matter. Fraud was fraud. The agents spent 6 hours in the vault, photographed everything independently, asked questions in a systematic way that revealed they had already done significant background work before arriving. They were polite, professional. They did not tell Ezra what they had found or what they intended to do. But on the way out, one of them, the younger of the two, a woman with the direct bearing of someone who had learned that directness was more efficient than indirection, paused at the vault door and looked at the room one more time. "Mr. Hartwell built this well," she said. "Not to anyone specifically." "Yes," Ezra said, "he did." She nodded once and left. Cross came on the 5th day. He came to the front door of the manor at 9 in the morning with 2 lawyers, and the particular energy of someone who has received information that has disturbed a plan he has been maintaining for a very long time. He was a large man, well dressed in the way that said the clothes were chosen for a reason. His face held the remnants of a warmth that had not entirely survived the morning's news. Ezra opened the door. Cross looked at him, at the house behind him, at the fact that Ezra was standing in the doorway of a property that Cross had spent years trying to acquire and that was now, quite clearly, not going anywhere. "Mr. Webb," Cross said. "Mr. Cross," a pause. "I'd like to have a conversation. We're having one," Ezra said. Cross's jaw moved slightly. He had come prepared for negotiation, for offers, counteroffers, the choreography of a transaction that he had assumed was still possible. The lawyers behind him were carrying briefcases and the specific readiness of people who had prepared documents. "I understand you've been in contact with federal investigators," Cross said. "I've been cooperative with federal investigators," Ezra said. "Those are different things." Another pause. "The land instruments," Cross started, "are valid," Ezra said. "Filed, recorded, witnessed, and maintained in condition that a federal court will find compelling. Your attorneys have seen this too, I imagine, based on the expression you came in with." Cross looked at him for a long moment. And here was the thing about Reginald Cross that Ezra had not expected. The man was not stupid. He was not fundamentally cruel. He was a man who had spent 20 years building towards something, using information he had obtained through someone else's dishonesty. And he had known somewhere in himself that the foundation was not clean, and he had built on it anyway, because the alternative was to walk away from something he had already invested decades in, which was not a decision Ezra couldn't understand. He understood it very well, he just couldn't let it stand. "What do you want?" Cross said, and the professional warmth was gone now. Just the question. Direct. One man to another. "I want what Edmund Hartwell wanted," Ezra said. "For what he built to be acknowledged. For what was taken from him to be returned. Not in a courtroom, not as a transaction." He paused. "I want Millbrook to know who built this house and why it matters that they forgot." Cross looked at the house. The wraparound porch, the ornate trim, the turrets. That's it, he said. That's not a small thing, Ezra said. And we'll need to work out the land situation separately, with lawyers, yours and mine. But that's not a question of what I want. That's a question of what the records say. Cross was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the paralegal, the one who sold me the family history documentation. Yes. I knew it wasn't clean, Cross said. Not an admission, exactly. But not an admission, I know, Ezra said. They looked at each other. My grandfather told me about this property, Cross said. Stories about Hartwell, about the hidden room, about what he was supposed to have put in it. My grandfather's father had worked on this house. During construction. He said Edmund Hartwell paid better than anyone else in the county and treated his workers like they were worth treating right. He paused. My grandfather said this house was built with more care than anything else in Millbrook, and that the people who tried to erase it would eventually lose. Ezra said nothing. I thought claiming it was the right thing, Cross said. I told myself I was honoring the connection. You were honoring it wrong, Ezra said. A very long pause. Yes, Cross said, I was. The lawyers behind him shifted slightly. One of them started to say something. Cross raised a hand without looking at them. They stopped. The development on the encumbered land, Cross said. We'll need to negotiate terms. I'm not in a position to simply. I understand, Ezra said. That's what lawyers are for, and the federal matter. That's what that is, Ezra said. I can't help you with that. Cross nodded, slowly. He looked at the house one more time. And there was something in his face then, not defeat exactly. Not the expression of a man who had lost cleanly. More the expression of a man who had built something on wrong ground and was now having to look at what that meant for the structure. Edmund Hartwell deserves to be in the town history, Cross said. He does, Ezra agreed. I have some influence with the historical society. Ezra looked at him. Then use it. Cross turned. Walked back down the front steps with his lawyers. Got in the vehicle. Drove away. Ezra stood in the doorway of Hartwell Manor for a while after the vehicle disappeared. The gray morning had burned off at some point while he wasn't paying attention. The sun was out now, coming through the oak trees on either side of the driveway, in long angles that put gold light on the overgrown grass, and on the peeling paint of the porch, and on the iron gate at the end of the drive. It was a beautiful property. He had been so focused on its problems that he had not let himself see that clearly until now. But it was. The bones Renée's word were extraordinary. The scale and the craft, and the vision of a man who had understood that building a thing right meant building it for a future he would not see. He thought about Edmund Hartwell in 1901, standing in front of a rising stone foundation, in a shirt that had been rolled to the elbows, looking at the camera with that particular directness, building something, with the full knowledge that the world he was building it in would not always be kind about what he was doing, building it anyway. Because some things are worth building, even when the people around you would prefer they didn't exist. Because the act of building is itself a kind of argument. And the thing that stands after you're gone makes the argument on your behalf, long after you can no longer make it yourself. Renée appeared behind him. She had been inside working. She came to stand in the doorway and looked out at the driveway, at the oak trees, at the morning light on the grass. He left, she said. He left. The lawyers looked scared. They should be, Ezra said. Imani is very good at her job. Renée was quiet for a moment. She had her sketchbook in her hand, open to a page where she had been drawing the vault. Not the contents. The space itself. The proportions. The way the circular room was built to hold without being showy about it. She said, "What did Harold's letter say?" "The part you didn't read to us." Ezra looked at the driveway. He said, "Edmund's story wasn't finished," he said. "It was interrupted. And that interrupted stories need people with the patience to find where they were left off." Renée looked at the manor, at the windows, at the plasterwork visible through the parlor window, where the morning light reached it. "We're going to restore it," she said. Not a question, yes, and then we figure out what it's supposed to be next. He paused. Edmund built it to do something, to mean something, not just to stand there. She was quiet for a moment. Then the land. Imani says we have strong standing. Cross built on it. Cross built on land he should have verified. Ezra put his hands in his pockets. That's a legal conversation that's going to take a while. But the instruments are valid. The deeds are filed. Edmund held on to what was his even when he couldn't stay to protect it himself. He paused. "We're not taking anything that wasn't already there." Darnell appeared behind them both. coffee in hand. The third cup of the morning, Ezra was fairly certain. The FBI called Imani, Darnell said. They've opened a formal investigation into Cross for document fraud. Yes, Ezra said. They want to talk to us again tomorrow. Yes. Darnell looked at the driveway, at the oak trees, at the gate. Harold knew Cross was going to come, he said. Harold knew everything, Ezra said. He just couldn't move all the pieces himself. Darnell drank his coffee. The electrical system in this house, he said after a moment, is going to be a 6-month job. Minimum. I know. I'm going to need to bring in help for some of it, I know. A pause. I'm available, Darnell said. If you need someone to run the electrical work, long term. He looked at his father. Looked away. I've been thinking about taking on an independent project. Something with some scope to it. Ezra looked at his son. Darnell was 32 years old, with a contractor's license and calloused hands and a face that gave nothing away, unless you had been watching it for 30 years and knew what to look for. What Ezra saw in it now was something he had not seen there in a while. Not excitement. Something steadier than excitement. Purpose. I'll need a project manager, Ezra said. Darnell finished his coffee. Yeah, he said. You will, Renée said quietly. To the air, to the house, to nobody in particular. The bones are good. And Ezra, standing in the doorway of a house that had been waiting a century for the right people to walk through its door, thought about Edmund Hartwell looking at a camera in 1901 with his sleeves rolled up and his foundation rising behind him. Thought about Harold pressing a lamp into a vault so whoever came next could see. Thought about a word carved into a pantry wall. Begin. He looked out at the morning, at the light on the grass, at the iron gate at the end of the drive which needed paint. Everything needed something. But the bones were good, and they were here. 8 months. That was how long it took to get the electrical system in Hartwell Manor to a state that Darnell described as acceptable, which in Darnell's language meant something closer to excellent. He did not use the word excellent. He used acceptable and let the work speak for the rest. 8 months of Darnell arriving before 7 every morning in a truck that became a permanent fixture in the manor's driveway. 8 months of his notebook filling with diagrams and cost estimates, and the names of electricians he trusted and plumbers he did not, and structural engineers who drove down from Atlanta on Tuesdays to look at the things Darnell pointed at and confirm that yes, Edmund had built this wall to hold a great deal and no, it was not going anywhere. Ezra went back to teaching. This surprised people, his family primarily. Calvin had called twice in the first 2 weeks after the vault discovery with suggestions about financial advisors and investment strategies and the manner of a man who has recalculated his position relative to his brother and is finding the new math uncomfortable. Ezra had thanked him both times and returned to his classroom. Because the legal situation with the land was not resolved. Not even close. Imani Broussard had looked at the instruments in the vault, looked at Cross's development footprint, looked at the chain of fraudulent documentation Harold had catalogued in that folder, and told Ezra plainly, this is going to take time. Not weeks, not months. She said 14 months, maybe more, with the even tone of someone who had learned that accurate timelines were kinder than optimistic ones. So Ezra taught. He walked into classrooms that were not his, and stood at the front of them, and talked about the thing he had spent his professional life talking about, American history. The record of what people did to each other and for each other, and despite each other. He had taught it the same way for most of his career, with accuracy, with competence, with the professional distance of someone presenting important material about events that were significant and also, at some level, safely past. He did not teach it that way anymore. He could not have said exactly when the shift happened. Somewhere in the 3rd month, maybe. Somewhere between standing in Edmund's vault, reading land deeds and standing in front of a 9th grade classroom in Decatur, talking about Reconstruction. The connection between those two experiences had rearranged something in him that did not rearrange back. He started teaching history as something people left behind, not just as something that happened, as something that was built deliberately, by people who understood they were building for a future they would not see. He talked about the documents those people filed, and the structures they created, and the ways they found to hold on to things when holding on was dangerous. The students noticed something different about him. He couldn't have named what, but they paid attention in a way that sometimes caught him off guard, the way attention does when you're not used to having it directed at you fully. One girl in a 9th grade class, 2nd period, a Tuesday in November, raised her hand after a lesson on reconstruction and said, "Why do we only learn about what went wrong? Why don't we learn about what people built?" Ezra looked at her for a moment. "We're going to do both," he said. "Starting today." She nodded and wrote something in her notebook, and he stood at the front of that borrowed classroom and felt, for the first time in longer than he could measure, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Renée drove down from Atlanta on weekends and sometimes on Wednesdays when she couldn't stay away. Her design practice had not yet reopened under her own name that was still being assembled, still becoming real. But she spent those 8 months doing something she would later say was the most useful education she had ever received. She learned the house, not as a structure to be rendered in elevation drawings and submitted for approval, as a system designed by a mind she was only beginning to understand, with solutions to structural and spatial problems that were elegant in ways that current practice had largely stopped attempting. She stopped fighting the reading glasses sometime around month 3, just wore them. This was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She also started bringing her own coffee instead of stopping at the gas station on the edge of town, which Darnell pointed out meant she was treating the commute as a routine rather than a special trip, which meant she had made a decision about this place without announcing it, which was exactly how Renée made all her real decisions. He said this to her on a Tuesday morning in month 5, standing in the manor kitchen, each of them holding a cup. She said, "Don't." He said, "I'm just observing." She said, "Observe somewhere else." But she was not actually annoyed, and they both knew it. And that was the thing about Darnell. He noticed the things that mattered and said them plainly and did not require a response, which was the only kind of observation Renée could tolerate. Imani Broussard called on a Thursday in the 14th month. Ezra was in the parking lot of a middle school in Decatur, eating a sandwich in his car, because the break room had been crowded and he needed 15 minutes without someone needing something from him. His phone lit up with Imani's name and he set the sandwich down. "Tell me," he said. "The court agreed with our reading of the 1,928 instruments," Imani said. "The entities are valid. Beneficial ownership vested in Edmund's estate and by succession through Harold's designation to you." He said nothing. "The land parcels are yours, Ezra. All 340 acres. The instruments held." He looked through the windshield of his Camry, 158,000 miles now, the stuck window still stuck at the parking lot of a middle school in Decatur, Georgia, at the yellow buses at the curb, at the ordinary Thursday afternoon of it. He said, "And Cross." Cross agreed to a remediation settlement. His attorneys pushed hard for 6 weeks, and then they looked at our documentation and stopped pushing. She paused. "He'll pay a negotiated sum to the Webb estate for the period of use of the encumbered land, and he'll complete the development under a revised agreement, a formal lease arrangement for the portion he's built on terms that are favorable to you." Another pause. "He also contacted the Millbrook Historical Society last month. His name isn't on the correspondence, but the content is a formal request for a review of Edmund Hartwell's omission from the county historical record." Ezra let out a breath he had been holding for approximately 14 months. "Harold would find that funny," he said. "I thought you might say that," Imani said. "Congratulations, Ezra. Edmund Hartwell's patience just paid off." He sat in the parking lot for 11 more minutes after he hung up. Not because he needed to think, because he needed to sit with it, the way you sit with something real before you start moving again. Then he called Darnell. Darnell answered on the second ring. There was background noise, a saw maybe, or something mechanical. The sounds of a worksite. Imani called. Ezra said, "A pause." The background noise stopped. "We won," Darnell said. "Not a question, we won." A longer pause. Then Darnell said, "I'm going to need to call the flooring supplier." Ezra said, "What, the front hall?" "I've been holding off on the hardwood order because I wasn't sure the full project was continuing." Ezra could hear him moving. "Now I know it's continuing." Ezra laughed. Full laugh. The kind that started in the chest and did not ask permission. The kind he had not produced in longer than he could locate precisely. Darnell waited for it to finish. "Call the supplier," Ezra said. "Already have my phone out," Darnell said. He called Renée next. She answered before the first ring completed. Of course she did, he told her. She was quiet for 3 seconds, which for Renée was a long time. Then she said, "I need to go back to the drawings. The center drawings. There's a detail in the entrance sequence I haven't been able to commit to. I think I was waiting to know if it was real." A pause. "Now I know," He said, "Go back to the drawings." She hung up. He drove to Millbrook. Renée arrived that Saturday with 3 rolled drawings under one arm and her laptop bag over the other shoulder, and the expression she wore when she had been working on something for several days and was ready, finally, to show it. She spread the drawings on the library table, which was now clear of dust and restored close to what it had been. The lamp Harold had placed in the vault had been brought up and installed here, properly wired by Darnell, because it seemed right that Harold's light should be somewhere it could illuminate something. The drawings were elevations and plans, not of the manor as it was going to be. The restoration plans for the manor itself, the exterior returned to its 1902 appearance, the wraparound porch rebuilt to Edmund's original specifications, the hidden passages documented openly in a separate layer as part of the building's history rather than its secret, and beside it on the drawings a new building, small, set back so it didn't compete, glass and reclaimed brick, and along the facade, worked into the material transitions, the same geometric motif from Edmund's cornice work translated into the modern surface so that anyone who looked carefully would see the connection. The Edmund Hartwell Center for Historical Memory. Ezra looked at the drawings for a long time. Renée stood across the table and watched him look. She had started doing that recently, watching him differently, less measured, as if something in her calculation of him had shifted and the new result was still settling. He had noticed and had not said anything because some things needed their own time before you could name them without spooking them. He said the name. Yes, not a fund, not a scholarship. No, she said, something here, something you walk into. He looked at the elevation of the new building, at the geometric motif on the facade. She said quietly he was saying something. He looked up at her. She held his eyes. Edmund. Everything he built, the passages, the carvings, the vault, he was saying something the whole time. He just needed someone to be in the right place to hear it. Ezra looked at his daughter across the library table. She was 28 years old. She had a pencil behind her ear and her reading glasses on her face and plaster dust on the hem of her dress from something she'd been examining in the corridor, and she hadn't noticed or hadn't cared. She had designed a building, a real one, under her own name. The first, he said, "You designed this alone, yes, no firm, no one." A pause. "It's the first thing I've ever made for a client I actually care about getting right." He said, "I care about it too." She said, "I know that now." Which was everything. Which was the whole conversation they had not been able to have for about 4 years, compressed into 4 words. He looked back at the drawings. She picked up her pencil. They worked. Odessa Pruitt came to the manor for the first time in 31 years on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Renée showed Ezra the drawings. She had been to the caretaker's cottage many times to sit with Harold, to bring documents, to drink tea, and talk about Edmund Hartwell with the completeness of 2 people who had decided the subject deserved all the time they had. But she had not entered the manor since the early 1990s, when she had come with a historical society committee that had done a preliminary assessment and filed a report recommending demolition. She had disagreed with that report. She had signed it anyway, because she had been junior on the committee, and because the pressure around the Hartwell property in Millbrook at that time had been of the kind that does not announce itself openly. She had regretted signing it since. Ezra brought her in through the front door. She stopped in the foyer. The plasterwork on the ceiling cleaned, repaired in 3 places where water damage had opened cracks. The cornice border, re-gilded to Edmund's original specification, caught the morning light from the stained glass windows and held it. The amber and green fell across the restored hardwood floor in the same geometric shapes it had made when Edmund first installed those windows in 1902. Odessa stood and looked up, did not speak for almost a minute. Then she said, "He built this the way you build something you expect to outlast everything." "Yes," Ezra said. "I should have fought harder in 1993. "You kept the archive for 15 years on the word of one man," Ezra said. "You asked me the right question when I walked through your door. You waited." He paused. "That's not nothing, Odessa." She looked at Edmund's portrait above the parlor fireplace, hung properly now, properly lit, no longer leaning against a wall wrapped in canvas. Edmund Hartwell looked back at the room he had built with the same directness he had always had. She said, "He looks like he knew." "I think he did," Ezra said. "I think that's the part that's hardest to sit with. He knew what was coming and he built anyway." She was quiet. "He built anyway," she said. and the way she said it made it something different from what Ezra had said, made it land somewhere. He walked her through the house. All of it. The restored library with Edmund's ledger displayed in an archival case beside Harold's lamp. The parlor. The master bedroom, the closet, where the panel stood open now, not hidden, not secret, displayed as what it was, part of the house's story rather than its concealment, the passage. The 12 stone steps. The vault. Empty now. Clean. The shelving units still in place but bare. The documents properly archived in Renée's system. The filing cabinets gone to Imani's office for the legal proceedings. Just the room. The circular stone room that Edmund had built into the foundation in 1901, with the patience of a man thinking across decades. Odessa stood in the center of it. Ezra stood beside her. She said, "Harold sat here." "I think so. He told me once he'd found a room he couldn't open. He said he sat outside the door sometimes." She looked at the bare shelves. He said it made him feel near Edmund. The way being near something someone made feels like being near the person. Ezra thought about Harold pressing his hand on Ezra's forearm at their last Christmas together. The brevity of it. The certainty. You'll know when it's yours. "He chose you carefully," Odessa said. "He always chose carefully," Ezra said. "He just didn't explain himself while he was doing it." She turned and looked at him. Something in her face was the precursor to a smile without quite becoming one. "You sound like Harold," she said. He said, "That might be the best thing anyone's told me." The groundbreaking for the Edmund Hartwell Center for Historical Memory happened on a Saturday in April. Not a large event. Ezra had been specific about this. He had attended too many commemorations of things that deserved genuine attention, turned into occasions for speeches, and the performance of caring that sometimes covered for the absence of actually caring. He wanted something smaller, something that fit what was actually happening. 43 people came. Odessa. Imani, who drove down from Atlanta in a car that said she had not come to work but to witness, which was different. Several people from the Millbrook community who had been following the story as it was carefully, accurately made public, over the preceding months, through Odessa's presentation to the Historical Society, through a piece in the county paper that had been written with the thoroughness the subject required, through the kind of word of mouth that moves through communities when something genuinely significant has occurred and people recognize it. Darnell was there with the construction crew he had assembled. Over the past 8 months, 6 people, each of whom he had chosen for a specific reason he had written in his notebook and not shared with anyone. They stood together on the far side of the staked site boundary, not attending the ceremony exactly, more present at the beginning of something they were about to spend a great deal of time on. Renée stood beside her father with the rolled elevation drawing of the center under her arm. She was wearing a dress the color of deep water, fitted, her reading glasses tucked into the neckline, her hair pulled back. She had the pencil behind her ear. She had been working this morning before they came out, and had forgotten to put the pencil somewhere else. She did not need it to be a ceremony. She needed it to be real. Cheryl came. She had called 3 weeks earlier with the careful opening of someone who is not sure how their call will be received. She had said, "I hear it's happening." Ezra had said, "April." A pause. Then she said, "I'd like to come, if that's appropriate." He said, "The kids will want you there," which was true, and also not the complete truth. But the complete truth was a longer conversation, and this was not its moment. She stood on the other side of Renée and held the flowers she'd brought, without knowing what to do with them, which was so precisely Cheryl that Ezra had a sudden clear image of their wedding day, and the way she had held her bouquet, like it was a problem she hadn't been warned she'd have to solve. He did not mention the flowers. "Some observations belong to yourself." Someone had placed a photograph on a small easel at the edge of the site. The 1901 photograph of Edmund Hartwell in front of the rising foundation. Shirt sleeves. Looking at the camera. Building something. Ezra stood at the easel before the ceremony began. Just him and the photograph and the April morning. He said very quietly, "You built it for someone you'd never meet. I hope we're getting this part right." Edmund looked back from 1901 with that directness. Not sternness. Not judgment. The expression of a man who has made his decision completely and is at peace with whatever comes next, because the decision itself was right. Whatever comes next, Edmund seemed to say. "This is built. This is real." Ezra turned. 43 people were looking at him. He had written notes. He did not use them. What he wanted to say and what the note said had turned out to be different things, and he chose what he wanted to say. He talked about Edmund Hartwell, about what the historical record had contained and what it had deliberately omitted, about what the vault had revealed not as a mystery solved or a treasure found but as what it actually was, a man who had built something extraordinary, been forced to leave before he could see it properly received, and had done what careful people do when they can see far enough ahead. He had structured his work to survive him. He had left instructions in a language that required patience to read. He had trusted that someone would do the reading. He said, Edmund Hartwell built this house in 1902 as a statement. He built it here, in this town, in full knowledge that this town was ambivalent about his right to do so. He built it anyway. Not from stubbornness, from conviction. The conviction that what you build with care and intention outlasts the resistance to it. He paused. 43 people were quiet. He was right, Ezra said. Another pause. Harold Webb kept this property standing for 30 years. Odessa Pruitt kept the archive. My daughter Renée designed what comes next. My son Darnell is going to build it. He looked at the photograph of Edmund, and Edmund Hartwell built the foundation 30 years before any of us were born and trusted it would hold. He said it one more time. It held. He stepped back. Darnell walked to the edge of the staked boundary, picked up the shovel that had been left there, drove it into the Georgia earth with the economy of someone who has moved a great deal of earth and knows exactly how much is required, lifted the first load, set it aside. He stepped back, handed the shovel to one of his crew, and looked at his father, just for a moment. A look that passed between them the way certain things pass between people who have known each other across a long and complicated history. Not a statement, not a summary, just a recognition. I was here, you were here, this happened. And we did this part together. Ezra nodded once. Darnell turned back to his crew and they began. The actual groundbreaking took 12 minutes. Then people stood in the April sun near the food tables. Someone had organized on the manor's porch and talked the way people talk at occasions that have meant something, the particular ease of people who are still inside an experience rather than looking back at it. Ezra moved through it slowly. He watched Renée at the edge of the construction area, showing something on her phone to one of Darnell's crew, a detail from the drawings, a specification she wanted understood from the start. Her hands moved the way they moved when she was explaining something she cared about getting right. The pencil was still behind her ear. She had not noticed it, or had noticed and decided it could stay. He watched Odessa standing in front of Edmund's photograph, standing there for a while, present, not saying anything. He watched Darnell with the crew, notebook in hand, already in a conversation that was not about the ceremony but about the work, which was exactly where Darnell needed to be. He watched Cheryl find a mason jar on one of the food tables, fill it with water from a pitcher, and put her flowers in it and set it in the corner where it would not be in anyone's way. Then she looked up and caught Ezra's eye and made a small gesture toward the jar, half apology, half shrug, and he raised his chin slightly in response, which meant it's fine, which meant more than it's fine. She looked at the manor for a moment, at the restored exterior, at the wraparound porch and the ornate trim and the turrets catching the April light. She said, across the small distance between them, Harold knew. Yes, Ezra said. About all of it, about all of it. She shook her head slowly. I told you not to let emotion make you stupid. He said, you did. She looked at the house, then back at him. I was wrong about what the emotion was. He did not answer that, because it was true, and because it was also the beginning of a longer conversation, and this was not its moment either. But he would remember she said it. He would carry it the way you carry things that matter, in the interior pocket close. He excused himself after a while and walked into the manor, through the foyer, with the stained glass morning light on the floor, through the corridor, into the library where Edmund's portrait was above the fireplace, and Harold's lamp was warm on the restored shelves, and the cherrywood had been cleaned to a color that was close to what it had been when Edmund first chose the wood and thought, this will last. He stood in the library for a moment. Then he went to the closet, through the panel, down the 12 stone steps, into the vault. He stood in the center of the circular room. Quiet, real quiet. The kind that rooms hold when they have been sealed a long time and then opened and then sealed again partially. The particular acoustic of stone and depth and age. He took Harold's letter from his coat pocket. He had been carrying it for 14 months. Transferred from coat to coat through the seasons, the paper worn at the folds to a softness that felt like something living. He unfolded it. Read the last paragraph one more time. What's in this room belongs to Edmund Hartwell. What you do with it is the final piece of what he built. Don't let anyone rush you. Don't sell what isn't yours to sell. And for the love of God, Ezra, don't let Calvin anywhere near the paperwork. He stood with the letter in his hands for a while. He thought about Edmund standing in front of a rising stone foundation in 1901 in his shirt sleeves, looking at the camera, building something he would not see completed in the way he had imagined, building it anyway, because the building was itself the argument, and the argument was worth making, even if you would not be there to hear the verdict. He thought about Harold in this vault, sitting outside the door he could not open, coming here across 30 years of seasons, in the dark with a flashlight, just to be near something Edmund had made, just to be near the fact of it. He thought about Renée's hand moving across the drawing board, about Darnell driving the first shovel into the earth, about Odessa standing in front of Edmund's photograph this morning, not saying anything, just present. He thought about a 9th grade girl raising her hand in a borrowed classroom in Decatur and asking, why do we only learn about what went wrong? Why don't we learn about what people built? He folded the letter, walked to the vault doorway, where Renée had designed a display case into the stone wall archival glass, proper lighting, set at eye level, the same standard as the cases in the foyer and the library. Because Harold's letter was part of the record, because the chain of transmission mattered as much as what was transmitted, because the people who came through this vault on the public tour in 3 months deserved to understand not just what Edmund had hidden, but how it had been kept, and by whom and what that keeping had required. He placed the letter in the case, stepped back, looked at it, Harold's handwriting behind the glass, small and careful and certain, the handwriting of a man who understood that what you write down is what you believe enough to commit. He turned off the vault light, stood for a moment in the dark at the bottom of the 12 stone steps. Then he went up, through the passage, through the closet, into the bedroom where the afternoon light was coming through the restored windows at a long angle, the way light comes through windows in April in Georgia when the afternoon is getting on, and the day has been full, and there's still some of it left, down the stairs, through the foyer, out the front door. The groundbreaking crowd had thinned. Most people had left or were leaving. The food tables were being consolidated. The construction crew had gone. Darnell with them back to the site, back to the work, which was where he needed to be, and which was exactly the kind of thing Harold would have recognized immediately and approved of without comment. Renée was on the front steps, sitting on the top one with her sketchbook open on her knees, the pencil moving in quick lines, shoes off, the deep water dress spread around her. She was drawing something from observation, not the building plans, not a technical drawing. Something she was seeing in front of her and putting down because she wanted to have seen it. She did not look up when Ezra came out. She said, "You went to the vault, yes." Harold's letter. Yes, she kept drawing. The pencil moved. Then she said, "Is it where it should be?" He sat down on the step beside her, looked out at the driveway, at the oak trees on either side with their old roots lifting the gravel, at the iron gate at the end of the drive which still needed paint, which was on Darnell's list for month 10, at the staked outline of the Edmund Hartwell Center for Historical Memory, its first turned earth catching the late afternoon light. "Yes," he said. She drew for a while. He sat beside her and did not need to say anything, and she did not need to say anything. And this was its own kind of conversation, the kind they had not been able to have for several years. And now they could. After a while she turned the sketchbook so he could see. She had drawn the front of the manor. Not the architectural elevation, not the technical record. The house as it looked right now in this light from this step. The way the afternoon came through the oak trees. The way the restored trim caught it. The way the stained glass windows held the color from inside, even when the light was hitting from outside. She had put Harold's lamp in the library window. A small warm square in the drawing barely suggested. She said, "I want to put this in the archive." He looked at the drawing. "The center archive," she said. "Not as documentation, as I don't know. As something someone might find in 50 years and understand what this afternoon felt like." He said Edmund would approve. She looked at him. Something in her expression settled. Not a smile exactly. The thing that comes before a smile when someone has been uncertain about something for a long time and has just stopped being uncertain. She turned the sketchbook back and wrote something small in the corner of the drawing. The date, her name, and below that 2 words. For later. He read it over her shoulder. She capped the pencil, put it behind her ear again, looked out at the oak trees and the late light and the beginning of what was going to be built. He built it for someone he'd never meet, she said, not a question. A statement she was letting herself make out loud. Yes, he said. And now we're building something for people we haven't met yet. He looked at his daughter, 28 years old, shoes off on the front steps of a house that had waited a century for the right people, sketchbook on her knees, pencil behind her ear, making the record. That's how it works, he said. That's always been how it works. She nodded once, opened the sketchbook to a new page, started drawing something else. Something she was already seeing that he could not see yet. And Ezra Webb sat on the front steps of Hartwell Manor in the April afternoon and listened to the Georgia air, moving through the oak trees, and thought about Edmund Hartwell, who had built a foundation in 1901 and trusted it to a future he could not see, who had carved a single word into a pantry wall and sealed a room and distributed a key across 3 hiding places, and trusted that eventually someone would have the patience and the attention and the right kind of love for interrupted stories to find all 3 pieces and put them together. He had found them. And from inside the house, through the open front door, Harold's lamp was on in the library window. Warm. Steady. The light of someone who kept a place ready for whoever was coming next, even when he did not know who that would be or when they would arrive. Just kept it burning. Because some things are worth keeping even when you cannot know if anyone is on the way. Because the keeping is itself a kind of faith. And faith, the real kind, the kind that doesn't require certainty, is what gets built into foundations. It goes in with the stone it holds.